Today, we're diving into a case that was way more than just a crime. It's a story about what happens when justice, politics, and just raw fear all smash into each other. We're talking about the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. So where do we start? Well, not at the beginning. Let's jump right into the fire to 1927. The entire world is watching America, and you've got huge names, Nobel Prize winners like Anatole France, basically pleading for mercy. And get this, 200,000. That's how many people showed up to march in the funeral procession for two convicted murderers, a shoemaker and a fishmonger. How does that even happen? So you have to ask, right? How did a local robbery murder in a small American town turn into one of the biggest international scandals of the 20th century? You had protests blowing up in every major city, from Paris to Johannesburg. To figure that out, we've got to rewind the clock 7 years. Okay, let's get into it. All right, Section 1, a global firestorm. Before we even get to the crime itself, you have to see the sheer scale of the reaction. It was absolutely massive. So when that verdict came down, it didn't just cause a stir. It ignited a global firestorm. We're not talking about a few scattered protests here. We're talking demonstrations in 60 Italian cities, protests shutting down streets in London, Paris, Tokyo, wildcat strikes paralyzing parts of South America. People in Johannesburg were burning American flags. It got so intense, there were even bombings at U.S. embassies. And the list of people pleading for clemency, it's just wild. You've got Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and get this, even the fascist dictator Mussolini. That's how big this was. So you gotta wonder, what on earth was the crime that started it all? Okay, Section 2, Crime in a Fearful Nation. Let's go back to where it all started. April 15th, 1920, Braintree, Massachusetts. A violent crime is about to set the stage for everything that follows. So, picture this. It's broad daylight, and a shoe company is moving its payroll, about $16,000. Suddenly, robbers attack. The paymaster, Frederick Parmenter, and a guard, Alessandro Baradelli, are shot and killed. The thieves grab the cash and take off in a stolen Buick. It was a brazen, brutal, and shocking crime for this small town. But here's the thing you absolutely have to understand. This didn't happen in a vacuum. America was in the grip of the Red Scare. This was a time of intense paranoia, this deep-seated fear of immigrants, radicals, and especially anarchists. You had bombings targeting government officials. You had the Wall Street bombing that killed 40 people. The country was on edge, looking for enemies. And into this climate of fear step our two accused men, Nicola Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fishmonger. And, for the authorities at the time, they checked all the boxes. They were Italian immigrants, they were atheists, and they were known anarchists, followers of Luigi Galliani, a guy who was so radical, he actually advocated for revolutionary violence. To the police, these guys look like the perfect suspects. So that brings us to Section 3, the trial on trial. Because when this case finally hit the courtroom in 1921, it became pretty clear pretty fast that Sacco and Vanzetti weren't the only things on trial. Their politics and their heritage were right there in the dock with them. Okay, so let's break down what happened in court. The prosecution laid out its case, right? They had eyewitnesses who identified Sacco, they had a bullet they claimed matched his pistol, they had Vanzetti's revolver, which was the same model as one that went missing from a dead guard, and they had a cap, found at the scene, that they said was Sacco's. But the defense started poking holes in everything. Those eyewitnesses, their stories were all over the place. One of them only identified Sacco a full year after the crime. The ballistics, we'll get to that, but it was shaky. And that cap, well, when they tried to put it on Sacco's head in the middle of the courtroom, it didn't even fit. And it gets even worse. The fatal bullet, bullet 3, was supposedly the smoking gun, but the prosecution's own expert later signed an affidavit saying he couldn't be positive it was a match. The police chief admitted he'd torn the cap himself, and then there's the judge, Webster Thayer. He was reportedly heard outside of court calling the defendants anarchistic bastards. So you've got shaky evidence and a judge who sounds anything but impartial. The whole thing started to feel less like a trial about a robbery and more about their political beliefs. All right, Section 4, a verdict heard worldwide. So after 6 weeks of this incredibly contentious trial, the jury comes back with a verdict. And the moment they read it, the shockwaves started spreading, and they didn't stop. On July 14, 1921, the jury found both Sacco and Vanzetti guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. And in that moment, these two men stopped being just defendants in a local crime. They became international symbols of a justice system on trial.
And Vanzetti himself understood this perfectly. Listen to what he told the court. I am suffering because I am a radical. And indeed, I am a radical. I've suffered because I am an Italian, and indeed, I am an Italian. He's basically saying, this isn't about evidence. You're convicting me for who I am. He framed the whole thing not as a legal battle, but as political and ethnic persecution. Now, you'd think that would be the end, but it wasn't. For 6 more years, the legal fight raged on. Appeals were filed based on recanted testimony and all that conflicting evidence, but Judge Thayer denied every single one. Then, in 1925, something incredible happens. A convicted murderer named Celestino Medeiros confesses to the Braintree crime, a confession! But even that wasn't enough. The motion for a new trial was denied. It really seemed like the system had made up its mind and nothing was going to change it. And so, on August 23, 1927, despite all the protests and pleas from around the world, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed by electric chair. Vanzetti's final words were reportedly, "I wish to forgive some people for what they're now doing to me." Okay, Section 5, 50 years to an apology. You see, the executions weren't the end of this story, not by a long shot. In fact, you could say it was the beginning of a legacy that raises huge questions about American justice that we're still grappling with today. So, for decades, the question just lingered. Were they actually guilty? The debate is incredibly complex. On one hand, ballistics tests in the 1960s seemed to confirm that a bullet came from Sacco's pistol, and there were even whispers from within the anarchist community, with one leader saying privately that Sacco was guilty but Vanzetti was innocent. But on the other hand, you have serious questions about whether that gun evidence was tampered with. You have the judge's obvious prejudice, and you even have a mafia informant who later claimed his gang was the one who actually did it. The more you look, the murkier it gets. And then, 50 years later, 50 years to the day after the executions, the state of Massachusetts finally made an official statement. The governor, Michael Dukakis, issued a proclamation. Now, this is really important. It wasn't a pardon. A pardon would imply they were guilty. And it didn't say they were innocent either. What it did say was that Sacco and Vanzetti had been unfairly tried and convicted. It was an official admission that the trial itself was a failure of justice, and it declared that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. And that's where the story leaves us. The Sacco and Vanzetti case is this powerful, haunting reminder of what can happen when fear and prejudice creep into the courtroom. It forces us to ask a really tough question. When justice and politics collide like this, can a verdict ever really be final?